OK, hello, and welcome to this presentation. It's not just malware, how to find secure software in open source repositories. To introduce ourselves, there's no reason for those in the back row to squint. This is us. I'm Robert, and I'm the director of threat detection at ReversingLabs. I've been in the security field for over 10 years.
And I'm Denis. I'm leading one of our development teams. And I've been a software developer for the past 8 years.
OK, so some of us here are developers. You solve problems, simple ones, complex ones. Whenever you solve problems, you probably solve problems that others have solved before. So maybe you think to yourself, I should have used the library for this. On the other hand, there are others. You also solve problems, but of a different kind. You use tools and software that others have written to solve your problems. But can either of you say that the software you're using is secure? When you hear the word security, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Penetration testing, malware, antivirus, secure coding practices? It doesn't matter. Regardless of the answer, by the end of the session, you will know that secure software is much more than a malware-free software. We've seen a proliferation of supply chain attacks in recent years. Many executive orders, directives, and guidelines have been created and written to make the risk visible, to hold parties accountable, and with the ultimate goal of reducing risk and potentially eliminating supply chain attacks. Risk, naturally, cannot be completely avoided, but it can be mitigated. The core problem in application security is the supply chain problem. That is, how does code get from the producer all the way to the consumer? To help with that, a framework called Salsa has been defined, and it visualizes the supply chain. It splits it into specific stages, ones belonging to source code repositories, the build infrastructure, and final packaging when it comes to the consumer. It also identifies 3 threat verticals and 8 specific attack types, which can be applied to different stages. For example, malicious commits on your source repository, or violating digital signatures somewhere later in the entire process. So we now have a burning question. How can we validate that the software we are using is secure? We have to take into account different perspectives based on different roles within the organization. However, the first thing that we have to ask ourselves is, what is software actually made of? And the answer to that is components. To help us list components comes the software bill of materials, or SBOM for short. The software bill of materials is a nested inventory. It's a list of ingredients your software is made of. Each component entry will contain its name, its version, its license, and potentially other identifiable data. You probably want your SBOM to be unique because you do not want to duplicate risks, and for that, you can use the package URL. Since SBOM is just a concept, naturally, there are many competing standards that try to implement it, some of which are CycloneDX and SPDX, which we will return to a bit later. One additional important thing to note about the SBOM is that an executive order exists which stipulates that you have to provide an SBOM with each software release. So now that we understand that software is made of components, we need to understand how to apply risk management strategies to each of those components. Risk management typically revolves around 4 specific stages. We first have to identify and understand the risk. That is, we need to find specific verticals, categories to group risk into. The second stage is that we have to measure it or quantify it. How often does a particular risk appear? Then we have to prioritize it. We have to see which risks need to be dealt with immediately and which can be postponed for later. Finally, we have to monitor risks. We need to see if new risks are creeping up in our application, or if existing risks are changing in probability or their impact. When talking about software components, we can categorize risks into compliance, exposure, and threats. Since these three categories are a bit too broad, it's natural to try to subdivide them into subcategories. So we can split the compliance stage, the one concerned with obeying the law, following regulations and internal policies, into licenses and secrets. Licenses are straightforward. Someone has given you a right to use a particular piece of software as long as you abide by the terms as presented by that license. They are legally binding. On the other hand, you have secrets. These typically fall into the sensitive information category, that is, internal policies, that you typically have a policy which states you do not want to leak sensitive data. So secrets are sensitive data, which are used to access infrastructure or business confidential data, such as passwords, tokens, and keys. The second vertical are exposures. Exposures detail your publicly available attack surface. That is, the surface that an attacker can use to misuse or subvert your product while it's being used. We can divide that vertical into vulnerabilities and mitigations. Vulnerabilities deal with bugs and issues that have a negative security-wise impact on your application, such as remote code execution that you did not intentionally put there. It's essentially a list of holes within your application that everyone else is aware of. Mitigations, on the flip side, are security mechanisms designed to lessen the likelihood of vulnerabilities being exploited. So mitigations help with known vulnerabilities, those that are detailed within the vulnerabilities segment, but also with unknown vulnerabilities, those that only an attacker knows about. The downside for this is that mitigations have evasions. So you can look at it like a seesaw. You have vulnerabilities on one end, and then mitigations on the other, trying to balance things out. Finally, we have the threats vertical, the one concerned with malicious and compromised code. We can split it into tampering and malware. Tampering deals with any kind of illegitimate code change. One common example are violated digital signatures. Now, when we mention digital signatures and cryptography, people often get the creeps. But it's a fairly simple concept to grasp, as will be demonstrated later. And finally, obviously, it is malware. It is potentially the most impactful of all of the categories, and it points to an exact instance rather than a possibility of malicious code being present within your application. So, now that we have understood that we have compliance, exposure, and threats vertical, can we truly say that we understand each of them? We should do a deep dive.
And let's start with licenses in a compliance vertical. As a developers, we want to build our software quickly, and we want it to do it painlessly. And the easiest way to do it, naturally, is to let somebody else do all the work for us. So we use existing packages, existing libraries, something that's on the internet, something that we can download for free. But it's not always free. Software usually comes with a license that tells us how it can be used and distributed. It's simple, really. But it gets a bit more complicated because software usually depends on other software. So a license, a package will have a dependence with different licenses. And in ideal world, the person who included that other software in their own work has already checked the license and is compliant, and everything is great. In practice, however, once you use something, you are responsible for it. It's your responsibility. What happens if you don't? Well, you can get sued. In this example, a company used a GPL license code. They did not disclose the source, and they lost a costly copyright lawsuit. Just a quick reminder here, GPL is copyleft license. That means that its rights need to be preserved in the derived work. We do all that. We can check the license, we check the license of dependencies. There's still a question of how reliable the information you just read really is. In a recent research, Darcy Clark, last year presenter at Shift, showcased how NPM data can be spoofed. What that means is, for this example at least, that the license you read is not the actual license. This attack vector can be used for worse things, but we're keeping it simple here. So, how do you prevent all this? Are there any tools and standards that can help you with this? Yes, there are. There's the SPDX standard that Robert already mentioned. It contains license identifiers, which can have exceptions and they can have expressions, which means that you can tailor them to your own specific use case. And tools that can help you make this standard are Dependency Track, for example. It's an open source tool. And both GitHub and GitLab have their own extensions, because of course they do. Next up, we're moving to the secrets on a compliance vertical. Secrets are sensitive information. And as developer, we're often given keys to the kingdom. We need to access a machine somewhere, use a token to log into REST API, user and password, doesn't matter really. In ideal world, those secrets are hidden somewhere, safe and secure. In practice, they're not. Sometimes we hardcode things into a script. Sometimes we commit it to a Git, add it to a Docker image, or even publish it on a public repository. When that happens, the potential impact is not just one person, but your entire organization or even your entire customer base. In this example, Toyota had a token leaked. The researcher who got to it was able to access their entire database, over 14,000 user accounts, sensitive information, copyrighted material, information about their product, about their customers, and about their partners. And they are not the only ones. In a research on Docker images, around nearly 9% of those images contained at least one secret, and many of them were still used in production. So once again, how can you prevent this? Are there tools? And so on. Yes. GitHub and GitLab have scanning capabilities. They can detect secrets, and it's simple to enable if you have the source code. If you don't, there are tools like GitLeaks or TruffleHog, which can tell you after the fact. And naturally, sites like Have I Been Pwned can help with password and things like that. We are moving to the exposure vertical, and first up are vulnerabilities. As Robert already said, vulnerabilities are basically bugs. Public bugs and severe bugs, but bugs nonetheless. When a bug becomes vulnerability, it gets a CVE identifier. It also gets a number which tells us how impactful it is, or what should be the priority when patching it or mitigating it. And one thing to note, when you include other people's work in your own, you also include their bugs, which means that their vulnerabilities are now yours, and they are your responsibility to fix. For example, some of you may have heard of Log4j. It's a popular Java logging framework. It was used, and it's still used, by a lot of people. It also had a zero-day exploit. It was simple, and it allowed remote code execution. In the first day, it had nearly 60 exploits made to exploit this vulnerability. In the first 3 days, over 1 million attacks were launched. To this day, this vulnerability alone has cost millions in man-hours to patch, and there are still unpatched instances running in the wild. Besides the obvious risk of compromise, there's also a legal reason for you to patch vulnerabilities. And for example, if you want to work with US government, there is something known as non-exploitable vulnerabilities index. All vulnerabilities there, you must patch them if you want to work with US government in a very specific time frame. And one thing to note, just because you included something doesn't mean you're necessarily using the vulnerable parts of the code. And there is something called WEX, which can be used in SBOM to describe this, that you're using a code or not using it. So once again, where can you find all this information? How do you get to the known vulnerabilities? There's the National Vulnerability Database. You will have most of the information about vulnerabilities there. And also, Google has its own project, its open source vulnerability database. It contains very specific repository or information. And the upside of exposure verticals are mitigations.
So, mitigations. We've said they are security mechanisms designed to lessen the likelihood of vulnerabilities being exploited. Now, you might say, but I'm a web developer. I'm only concerned about XSS, SQL injection, and all that web stuff. But are you sure that you're only using JavaScript, for example? Are you sure that code on NPM is only JavaScript? Turns out, NPM allows native code modules, which are typically written in languages such as C and C++, which are compiled. When you have such languages, they're typically used, in this case, to provide more speed or to ostensibly provide protection for the code. But with compiled languages, you also invite memory corruption problems. And with those problems, you also get the mitigation acronym BINGO: non-executable, data execution prevention, address space layout randomization, and many more that you've probably never even heard of. Even big companies have trouble remembering them. In the ServView case, the ASLR, or the address space layout randomization mitigation, was not enabled. If it was, it wouldn't have fixed the bug, but it would have made it significantly less likely to have been exploited. The impact of this was that many companies running the ServView component with the affected SSH component had their data exfiltrated. Now, the problem with mitigations is that there's so many of them. They're compiler dependent that people just forget. And to help you list those, there are some tools. They will tell you which mitigations are missing on your software components and will typically suggest how to enable them. Now, we are moving to the final vertical, to the threats vertical, one concerned with malicious and compromised code. First up, tampering. Tampering is any kind of illegitimate code change. One common example, like we previously mentioned, are violated digital signatures. When you digitally sign a file, you're saying basically two things. I signed this file, and two, if the signature is not valid, someone else modified the file, it wasn't me, so do not trust it. To digitally sign code, you need to have a code signing certificate, which is typically issued by certificate authorities such as DigiCert and others. The process how digital signing works is fairly simple. You take your package, you hash it, you create a unique identifier, and then you encrypt it with your private key. Private, it belongs only to you. Now, what you have there is a digital signature. Now, when someone else wants to verify it, he takes your public key, which is published, hence the name, decrypts the unique identifier, calculates the unique identifier on his or her own, and compares if the two match. Why does it work? Well, mathematics. The important thing about digital signatures is that they're not used everywhere. For example, on NPM and NuGet, you can see the use of digital signatures. However, PyPI and RubyGems do not use them as much as they should. Digital signatures are bulletproof until your key is stolen or until your build infrastructure is compromised. And this happened to many companies, big and small. The impact of these attacks was their reputation, a lot of lost time, and money. However, in certain cases, it was painfully obvious that the digital signing process had been tampered with, and this could have been spotted before the release. Now, you can use many tools depending on your environment to verify if digital signatures are correct, such as OpenSSL, SignTool, SigCheck, JarSigner, and so on. And lastly, malware. That's the stuff that breaks the news. Information stealers, ransomware, backdoors, coin miners, just to name a few. Now, arguably, this is the most impactful category from all the others, but that is not to say that others can be neglected. So, package repositories are attacked because of two things. One, due to the ease of which malicious code can be submitted to those repositories. In the beginning, attackers only use typo squats, simple package name permutations. Then they move on to dependency confusion, reusing abandoned package names, and so on. The second reason is the potential target audience, and that is primarily developers. Many packages, when you include them in your project, will install, deploy some malware on your system, try to collect information about your environment, potentially collect keys, tokens, secrets, and other kind of stuff. But we are observing a shift, no pun intended, that some packages are now targeting end users. They're phishing them to collect their usernames and their passwords. Developers cannot see any kind of intrusion on their systems, but those packages are deployed finally by the end users. To deal with malware, you have a couple of strategies that you can try to use. For example, you can use traditional antiviruses and antivirus result aggregators. They are helpful, but up to a certain point. They typically they're dealing only with traditional malware and not so much supply chain attacks. If you're feeling adventurous, you can use sandboxes and try to run a malicious executable in an isolated environment. However, when dealing with open source projects, you'll probably have most luck using the GitHub advisory database. It contains a list of many known malicious packages, which can be used to simply filter everything out. And finally, for those who have much free time on their hands, they can manually inspect code and see if something is problematic.
Thank you. Right, we covered a lot of topics here. We covered many tools that can help you mitigate risks. Unfortunately, integrating and understanding them all would take a lot of time. There is a better way. We've built a free and simple site that can show you all those risks on open source software. It's called Find Secure Software. And this should look familiar to you. We have our free categories. We have compliance. We have exposure. And we have threats. And in this example, on NPM Package Express, we can see that there was permissive license that was used, no secrets were leaked, and so on. There is no malware. It's probably safe to use. Now, this is available to you now. We have cards with QR code on the boot. And we currently only support on NPM. In the future, we do plan to support other languages and repositories. It will stay free even after the official launch. And if you have any question, I do believe we have time for it. If there are no questions, well, thank you then.